early days. Oh, a better nation, fair and free, Scotland.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast, episode number 173. Now, there's been quite a lot of articles written recently about the report of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights to the United Kingdom. You can read the full text online, however, not everyone has the opportunity or the time to do that. So, here's the audio of the press conference about that report, and it's really just amazing listening. In this presentation he goes through large parts of the report, almost paragraph by paragraph, but then there's also a very interesting question and answer session at the end. So for those of you who prefer the audio medium, here it is. And before we get to the speech, I'll just leave you with this question. Don't you think an independent Scotland could do better than this?
So, good morning everybody. My name's Karen Davis and I'd like to welcome you all to this press briefing with Philip Alston, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Professor Alston, who is on an official visit to the United Kingdom at the invitation of the British government, will present his preliminary observations and recommendations following his human rights fact-finding visit over the last 2 weeks, including the impact of austerity measures, universal credit, child poverty and Brexit. After his presentation, there will be an opportunity for journalists present to ask questions. So over to you.
Thanks very much. So I do want to start, first of all, by thanking the British government and by thanking all the officials who have made my visit smooth and easy. I've had terrific access from ministers down through local authorities to civil society and other groups. The main thrust of my report is to contrast the great prosperity in Britain, fifth largest economy, one of the leading financial capitals in the world, a thriving industrial and financial centre, contrasted with the fact that a fifth of the population, 14 million people, are living in poverty. 4 million of those are more than 50% below the poverty line, and 1.5 million are destitute. The child poverty rates are staggering and are predicted by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and others to go up significantly over the next couple of years. The picture, however, is much more complex than just rattling off statistics. What has surprised me is the extent to which there is close to unanimity in terms of the observations by think tanks, by a lot of media commentators, by independent authorities like the National Audit Office, by a whole range of parliamentary committees and others, that poverty is really a major challenge in the United Kingdom, and that not nearly enough is currently being done to address the challenges. On the other side, what I found in my discussions with ministers is basically a state of denial. The ministers with whom I met told me that things are going well, that they don't see any big problems, and they are happy with the way in which their policies are playing out. But it's of course not the story that I heard in my travels through Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and in quite a few cities in England. What I saw, food banks, schools, community centres, job centres, libraries and elsewhere, is a lot of misery. A lot of people who feel that the system is failing them, a lot of people who feel that the system is really there just to punish them, people who feel that despite the fact that they are really down and need a little bit of help that they could always have counted on in yesterday's Britain, they're just not able to get. And so what I've tried to do in my report is to ask why. What's the motivation for the main policies that seem to be problematic in the benefits area? And the answer that most people come up with is, it's austerity. In other words, the implication is that there was no choice. There was a financial crisis. There was a need to make immense budget savings, and benefits was one of the key areas where that could be done. The truth is that, first of all, there haven't been a great many savings from what I can see. A lot of it has involved the transfer over from one set of items to another. A lot of it has been pushed off to the community, to families, to emergency rooms, and to even governmental emergency services rather than in the benefit system itself. I don't see that the motivation has been to create a more compassionate, a more caring benefit system, and one that actually produces better life outcomes for people. Instead, the motivation is very clearly, I believe, an ideological one. I don't say that in a necessarily critical way, because governments have different ideologies. Governments think of social welfare in different ways, and this government and its predecessor have both been remarkably successful in bringing about a revolution in British welfare policy. They have transformed the nature of the system, and particularly the underpinnings of it. The problem that I see is not in terms of the worthy objectives. It is true that employment is a key to getting people out of poverty. It is true that the previous system was confused and confusing. It's true that there are efficiencies that have been found. But what's also happened is that the system, epitomised by universal credit, about which I'll talk more in a moment, but not at all limited to that, is in fact driven by the desire to get across a simple set of messages. The state does not have your back any longer. You are on your own. As Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as society. The government's place is not to be assisting people who think they can't make it on their own. The government's place is an absolute last emergency order. And so what goes along with that is a sense that we should make the system as unwelcoming as possible, that people who need benefits should be reminded constantly that they are lucky to get anything, that nothing will be made easy. And linked to that is what I would think of as a sergeant major mentality. As one MP put it to me, the command and control approach reflected in universal credit. That sanctions should be harsh, should be immediate, should be painful. And yet, all of the evidence that I've seen, notwithstanding various assertions made by DWP, indicate that sanctions are usually counterproductive, that they create fear and loathing among claimants, that they impose immense hardships on people who might have been 5 minutes late for an appointment, might have screwed up in some other way, but instead of trying to work through with people who are already under immense stress, there is this sudden ton of bricks approach. And the ton of bricks goes from 3 months to 6 months and can go into the years. And I think that sort of punitive approach to benefits is utterly inconsistent with the essential underpinnings, not just of what I would see as human rights, but of the whole British sense of community and the values of justice and fairness. My report also focuses on Brexit, which is an issue that seems to be of current interest. I make the argument, which is not going to be all that unfamiliar, that almost no matter what outcome Brexit achieves, other than the utopian one, which is most unlikely to happen, is going to leave Britain worse off economically. There's going to be a fall in GDP. There's going to be a fall in tax revenues. I don't think that's controversial. I think most Treasury modelling says that. The IMF says it in a very major way. The problem is that there's been almost no discussion about what impact that's going to have on low-income groups. They will, if present policies are maintained, bear the brunt of the economic fallout from Brexit. And to the extent that most commentators think that the Brexit vote itself had an element of economic alienation, of insecurity underpinning it, in fact, Brexit is going to make that worse, because those in the lower income levels are really going to suffer. I think it's imperative that that issue be brought much higher up on the agenda. It's every bit as important as getting a lot of things right in terms of the interests of the city, in terms of the free flow of trade and so on. The impact on the British people is not being examined in the way that it should be. I go into some detail on universal credit, and I won't try to encapsulate all of the issues here, but I think there are a number of characteristics of it which are particularly problematic and harsh, and more interestingly, unnecessary and almost gratuitous, and could therefore be changed fairly quickly. The 5-week waiting period, reduced to 3 for some, but very often amounting to 12 for others because identification document can't be found or whatever. That is an amazing part of the system, which means that people who are completely unable to cope go to a benefits office, go through the process of applying, succeed, and they're told, good, you've got nothing, you're really in desperate straits, go away, and maybe in 5 weeks, if you're lucky, although it might be 12, we'll give you some money. They're plunged into misery and despair. They're plunged into a circle of having to beg from family and community. And then DWP will say, no, but we could give you an advance. So they'll provide an advance if you're really desperate. That advance then needs to be paid off at the rate of 30% from each of your paychecks when they finally start arriving. So you are guaranteed that with a very small benefit amount, 30% of that is immediately taken off. And so it's really getting off to a great start and giving people a wonderful sense of the whole universal credit and DWP process. That should be changed immediately. The payment to a single household has drawn a lot of attention. It's said, and I completely accept it, that the impact on many women is extremely problematic, that they are not able to control the family income, that the male in the household dominates, and that it even puts them at greater risk of domestic violence. The response that I got from the former Secretary of Work and Pensions was, first of all, 93% of people in the United Kingdom have joint bank accounts anyway, so what's the problem? Well, it would be interesting to see what the figures are for women living in poverty, whether they have joint bank accounts. Most of them don't have